Don't you dare touch my phone. Emily, Daniel snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. The words stung, but it was the way he grabbed his phone out of my hand so quickly that caught me off guard. Before I could even process what had happened, he was already clutching the device. A defensive, almost paranoid look in his eyes. I stood there, frozen, my fingers still wrapped around the delicate box in my other hand. The one holding his $5 birthday watch. I didn't move for a moment. It was like the world had stopped. The air around us felt thick, almost suffocating. I opened my mouth, trying to explain, but the words felt heavy in my throat. I was just turning off your alarm, so you could sleep in on your birthday, I said, my voice soft, the hurt creeping in as I spoke. Here, I got you something. My voice cracked, just enough for him to notice, but not enough for him to care. He barely glanced at the box. His attention was still fully on the phone in his hand, his eyes scanning the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered something that might have been a thank you, but it was so half-hearted, so mechanical, that it barely registered. With a quick motion, he placed the box aside, ignoring the gift altogether. My heart sank. I'd saved for months to buy that watch, cutting back on little luxuries to afford it. I'd thought about it endlessly. Daniel had talked about wanting it for so long. I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he opened it. It wasn't just about the watch. It was about showing him that I cared, that I saw him, that I was there. But now, standing in front of him with the weight of his indifference pressing down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd even seen me at all. The clock on the wall ticked, the sound strangely loud in the silence that followed. His fingers moved over his phone, oblivious to the way my chest tightened. My hands shook just a little as I placed the box on the nightstand. He still hadn't looked up. His world was entirely consumed by whatever was on that screen. Whatever, whoever it was. It wasn't about the phone. Really, it wasn't about the watch. No, it was the way he wasn't here with me anymore. It was the growing indifference between us. The invisible wall that had started to build ever since he got this new job. This new life that I had no part in. I had thought it was just stress. The pressure of work. The promotion he was hoping for. I had told myself, it'll pass. The coldness. The distance. I just needed to give him space. But today, something inside me shifted. I felt it deep in my gut. A quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just about a promotion or stress. Maybe it was about something else. Something bigger that I was too scared to face. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 25 years old, and I've spent the last 2 years of my life believing that I could fix things between Daniel and me. But this morning, I realized that maybe our marriage was beyond saving. Not because of a phone, though his defensiveness over it was definitely suspicious, but because of something that hurt more than I ever could have imagined, the slow, suffocating indifference that had quietly taken root between us. A wall that felt impossible to climb. Something had changed, something I couldn't ignore anymore. And somehow, as I stood there, watching him scroll through his phone without even looking up, I knew that today would be the day I would finally face the truth. The truth about us, the truth about him, and the truth about what I was willing to do to find myself again. We met at a tech conference 3 years ago. I remember the way Daniel looked at me as if I were the most interesting thing in the room. I was used to men either intimidated by my technical expertise or those who would try to talk over me, explaining things I already knew. But Daniel? He listened. He didn't just hear me, he understood me. Our conversations flowed effortlessly. There was no condescension, no hidden agendas. He was genuinely curious about my thoughts, about my dreams. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. We started dating soon after. And things moved quickly. Our relationship had that easy rhythm, laughing over coffee, spending entire weekends talking about everything and nothing. The way he'd bring me coffee in bed on lazy mornings. How he'd patiently listen when I talked about my work, explaining the latest vulnerabilities I'd uncovered in security protocols. I remember thinking, this is it, he's the one. I even began imagining a future with him, marriage, a house, everything that seemed so natural back then. But somewhere along the way, something changed, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel became more distant. At first, I thought it was just work stress. He was always working late, constantly on his phone, texting and emailing in the middle of dinner. But then, it wasn't just work, it was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. And the more I tried to reach out, the more he withdrew. The first time I noticed it, I brushed it off. It was just a bad day, right? But as weeks turned into months, it became harder to ignore. Daniel stopped asking about my day. The long talks we used to have about our careers, our future, faded into awkward silence. The small gestures, bringing me coffee, complimenting my work, became fewer and fewer. The warmth that once defined our relationship turned into cold, mechanical interactions. It was like we were roommates, not partners. I tried to be understanding. He had that big promotion coming up. It was his dream job. And I was proud of him. I told myself that once the pressure of work and the performance review passed, things would go back to normal. But normal never came back. Instead, I found myself walking on eggshells, constantly wondering if I was doing something wrong. Maybe I wasn't supportive enough. Maybe I wasn't good enough. I began questioning everything. Was it me, or was it just the way he was now? And then, on our second anniversary, I bought him the watch. It wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of how much I cared, of how much I was willing to sacrifice to make him happy. I saved for months, cutting back on lunches, skipping coffee runs, just to afford it. I wanted him to know that I saw him, that I remembered the little things he talked about. But when I gave him the gift, his response was so flat, so detached, that it was like the wind had been knocked out of me. Thanks. That was all he said. No smile, no appreciation, just a quiet thanks that sounded more like an obligation than gratitude. I stood there, holding that $5 watch in my hands, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left me standing there, speechless, staring at the man I thought I knew. I want to connect with you. My amazing viewers, where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. In the days that followed, I told myself that it would pass. It had to, right? But as the weeks went by, the cracks in our relationship widened. The small, thoughtful things that had once defined us were gone. Instead, there was silence. And with that silence came the heavy realization that something deeper was wrong. Something I couldn't fix by simply being patient. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. By the time I noticed his behavior really shifting, spending more time on his phone, growing irritable when I asked even the simplest questions, I knew something wasn't right. I told myself it was stress. Told myself it was temporary. But deep down, I began to wonder if I was just making excuses. And then one day, it hit me, the moment when everything would change. The moment I discovered the truth. It didn't come with a loud crash or dramatic confrontation. No, it crept up on me quietly, almost imperceptibly. I was in the kitchen, trying to make dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was from Kate, my best friend, who knew everything about Daniel and me. She was the one I confided in when I was unsure. The one who had listened to my worries when I doubted myself. So, when I saw her name flash on the screen, I immediately felt a knot of unease twist in my stomach. Don't freak out, her message read, but I need to show you something. I almost didn't open it. Hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I was about to see. But curiosity got the better of me. And I unlocked my phone. The screenshot she sent was of Daniel's profile on a dating app. I froze. The first thing I noticed was the photo. A picture he had taken just 3 weeks ago during our weekend getaway to San Antonio. I had been the one to take that picture, of him smiling as we stood in front of a historic building. Hands intertwined. He had looked so happy in that moment, as if the world was ours for the taking. But now, that same photo was on a profile labeled, "Looking for a meaningful connection." The tagline underneath read, "Newly single and ready to explore what life has to offer." Newly single. We had celebrated our anniversary just last month. My stomach twisted painfully, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. I blinked, trying to shake off the dizzying wave of disbelief that washed over me. It couldn't be real. This had to be a mistake. There had to be some explanation. I quickly clicked on the profile, my hands trembling as I scrolled down. The more I read, the heavier my chest became. The words were an exact contradiction to everything we had shared. Successful, professional, seeking a meaningful connection. He had written that with such confidence, as though he had never once shared a life with someone else. The profile was everything he had ever said he wanted: someone who understood him, someone who appreciated his career, someone who could keep up with his ambition. But none of it was real. It was all a lie. I felt the tears begin to well up, but I forced them back. I couldn't cry. Not yet. I still didn't want to believe it. He couldn't have been this cold, this cruel, not after everything we had built together. But the truth was undeniable. The evidence was right there in front of me. Taking a deep breath, I locked my phone, trying to steady myself. I won't confront him yet. I couldn't. Not now. Not when I didn't know the full extent of it. I needed to understand exactly what was going on. I needed to know how deep this betrayal ran before I did anything. I slid the phone back into my pocket, my mind racing. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in on me as I thought about the man I had married. The man I had trusted completely. Everything I thought I knew about him, everything I thought we shared, had been shattered in an instant. The man I had spent years building a future with. The man who had been so warm and attentive, had been lying to me all along. I heard the shower turn off, signaling that Daniel was done. He'd be out in a moment. I smiled to myself, even though my insides were a chaotic mess. I need to stay calm. I need to be patient. The thought of confronting him now, of asking him about the profile, would only lead to excuses and lies. He'd deny it, twist the truth, and make me doubt myself. No, I needed to wait. I needed to gather more evidence, to watch him closer, to make sure that when I did confront him, I would have everything. As Daniel stepped out of the bathroom, I quickly wiped away the tears that had escaped, fixing my face into something neutral. When he came into the kitchen, I greeted him with a smile. The same smile I had worn for months now, perfectly composed. Perfectly fake. He didn't notice the change, of course. He never did. He never noticed anything anymore. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "How was your day?" He barely looked up from his phone, mumbling something about a long meeting. He was distracted again. Not that I was surprised. I had come to expect this indifference from him. "Everything okay?" I asked softly, pushing my anxiety aside. He didn't answer right away. His eyes glued to the screen. I stared at him for a moment, wondering how much longer I could pretend like everything was fine. How much longer I could convince myself that this was just a phase, that it would get better. He glanced at me briefly before turning back to his phone. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I'm just tired." I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, trying to keep my composure. He was already distracted, already lost in his own world. And that world didn't include me anymore. I excused myself and walked out of the kitchen, feeling the weight of everything pressed down on me. The emotional distance between us was so thick I could almost touch it. As I stood in the hallway, I fought back the urge to collapse. I had to keep it together. For now, I had a plan. I just needed to be smart about it. I couldn't confront him yet. But I would, soon. And when I did, he would understand exactly what he had done to me. To us. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not after everything. The idea came to me slowly, like a light bulb flickering on in the dark. The moment I saw Daniel's profile on that dating app, I knew I couldn't just confront him right away. That would give him a chance to deny everything, to twist the narrative, and I wasn't about to let him get away with it that easily. I needed something more. I needed him to face the truth head on, to understand exactly what he had done. And most importantly, I needed him to realize that I was always one step ahead. That night, as I sat in front of my laptop, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows in the quiet room, I began to map out my plan. I wasn't going to just expose his lies. I was going to make him feel them. Every word he'd written on that dating app, Every lie he'd spun would be thrown back in his face. He needed to see the consequences of his actions, not in a way he could explain away or dismiss, but in a way that would leave him speechless. I started with the basics. I needed to create someone new, someone believable. The profile would have to be perfect, tailored to his desires but just different enough to draw him in. I thought back to our conversations, to the things Daniel had always talked about, the things he liked and admired. He was attracted to ambition, success, and confidence. He liked women who were driven, who knew what they wanted, but not too intimidating, someone who could mirror his own ambition, but who also understood the balance of intimacy and independence. I spent hours poring over the details, crafting the perfect photo, choosing the right words, designing a life for this new persona that would intrigue him, but not raise suspicion. I used a photo of myself, but altered just enough for it to feel like a fresh face, someone familiar, yet completely new. The AI tools I used helped me smooth out the edges, creating the ideal digital version of myself that Daniel would want to connect with. Victoria Lawson, a 26-year-old digital marketing specialist, would be her name, not too far removed from my own, but just enough to make it believable. Her backstory was simple but convincing. She'd recently moved to the area for a new job, excited about new opportunities, passionate about marketing. I made sure to list interests that Daniel would find appealing: tech, business, even fitness. I wanted him to feel that there was something real between them, something worth pursuing. I created a LinkedIn profile for Victoria to give her credibility. Just another layer to make her seem like someone who could easily exist in his world. As I typed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cold satisfaction. There was something empowering about taking control of the narrative. For so long, I had been passive in this relationship, always waiting for things to get better, hoping that Daniel would snap out of whatever spell he was under. But now, I was the one pulling the strings. I was the one deciding how this story would unfold, and I would make sure that he would see everything I wanted him to. Once the profile was set, I turned my attention to the small, but significant details: Victoria's tone, her way of speaking. I couldn't make her sound too perfect, too rehearsed. She had to feel genuine. I mimicked the way I had spoken to him in the beginning of our relationship, playful, yet sincere, confident but open. I knew how to make him feel like he was the center of attention without him realizing it. I made sure to engage with him slowly, letting the connection build naturally, just like we had done when we first met. As the days passed, I kept the facade up. I'd check his phone when he was in the shower or out. I had created was starting to blur the lines between reality and illusion. And when the time came, when I finally revealed myself, when I made him face the truth, I would make sure that every little lie he had told would come crashing down around him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about showing him that actions have consequences. And when you betray someone who loved you, the price you pay is not something you can easily escape. I closed my laptop with a final click. Satisfied with the work I had done, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a moment, watching the cursor blink at me. The game was on now, and I was ready. The game had begun, and Daniel didn't even know it. Each morning, as I watched him smile at his phone, lost in his digital affair with Victoria, I felt a cold thrill. He was already falling for her, unaware that she was nothing more than my creation, crafted to feed his ego and draw him in further. I kept the conversation light, playful, never too eager, never too cold. Victoria was the perfect mirror of his desires: smart, ambitious, attentive. She gave him everything I used to, without the emotional weight of a real relationship. Slowly, his responses became more intimate. He shared his frustrations, his dreams, all with the woman who understood him, at least. That's what he thought. But it wasn't just about making him feel desired, it was about making him need her. Every message he sent to her made him drift further away from me. Late meetings, early calls, excuses that kept him distracted, pulling him deeper into the illusion of someone who would never challenge him. Someone who was easy to control. I watched as he fell for her, all while I stayed in the shadows, quietly controlling every move. And then, one evening, I pushed him further. I suggested meeting up with Victoria. knowing he'd take the bait. His quick response told me everything I needed to know. He was hooked. Completely unaware that the woman he desired wasn't even real. The pieces were falling into place. He thought he was in control. But I was the one leading this game. And soon, he would see the truth of his betrayal. The moment had finally arrived. I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach. But there was no fear. Only a quiet, seething anticipation. For weeks now, I had watched Daniel spin his web of lies, pulling me further and further away from the man I thought I knew. But today was different. Today, I would be the one to expose him. To tear down the image of the perfect life he had created outside of our marriage. And I wouldn't just confront him. I would make him see every single piece of the betrayal he had so carefully hidden. I had arranged everything. The dinner, the place. I had even coordinated with Antonio, the manager at his favorite restaurant. It was perfect, down to the smallest detail. Daniel thought he was meeting Victoria, the woman he had been flirting with for weeks. But what he didn't know was that I had planned for this night to be his reckoning. As I sat at my table, hidden in the corner of the restaurant, I could hear the soft murmur of other diners around me, their laughter and conversation blending into the background. But all I could focus on was Daniel. I knew he would come soon. I had made sure he would. Minutes later, I saw him walk in. His head held high, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He looked almost giddy. I watched as he spoke to the hostess, who guided him toward the table I had reserved. The same table we used to sit at, laughing, planning our future together. But now, it was a stage for his humiliation. The table was set for two. A single red rose in the center, just like something Victoria would have wanted. And as Daniel took his seat, looking down at his phone, waiting for the woman he thought was perfect for him, I could hardly contain the wave of satisfaction that flooded through me. It was strange, watching him there, waiting for the lie he had created to unfold. I realized how far removed I had become from the woman who had once loved him so deeply. I wasn't angry anymore. I was beyond that. This was about him learning the consequences of his actions. He had broken our trust, shattered the life we built. And now it was time to face the music. I didn't need to confront him directly, not yet. The plan was already in motion. As he checked his watch, waiting, I noticed a shift in his demeanor. His excitement seemed to wane slightly, replaced by confusion. He was looking around, almost anxiously, as if expecting something that wasn't coming. I watched as he checked his phone, a frown forming on his face as he read the text from Victoria. The same text I had sent earlier. Look underneath the envelope. I watched his expression change as he picked up the manila envelope, the one I had carefully placed at his seat. Slowly, hesitantly, he opened it. I could see the moment his mind began to unravel. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes flickering over the evidence I had so meticulously gathered. Screenshots of his conversations with Victoria. Messages between him and other women. Profiles from dating apps. His hand shook as he flipped through the pages, searching for an explanation, searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. Not for him. As he sat there, paralyzed by the truth, I could almost feel the weight of his regret. His phone buzzed again, and he checked it, his face draining of color. The message from Victoria had been timed perfectly. Look underneath the envelope. His hand trembled as he lifted the envelope, revealing the final piece of the puzzle, the divorce papers. I watched him sink back into his seat, disbelief written all over his face. He didn't speak for a moment, his mind clearly racing, processing everything he had just seen. And then, the words finally came. Emily, what is this? I stood up from my table, the movement deliberate, controlled. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent as I walked toward him. My heart steady, my steps calm. I stopped in front of his table, taking a long, measured look at him, the man who had once meant everything to me, who had promised me a future, now sat before me, crushed under the weight of his lies. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence hang between us, allowing him to feel the full weight of what was happening. His eyes flickered from the papers to my face, trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the lies he had been living. Finally, I spoke. This is goodbye, Daniel. My voice was steady, unwavering. Everything's there. The divorce papers. You wanted your freedom. Now you have it. His face twisted with realization. His eyes wide as he finally understood what had happened. You're Victoria, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You set this all up. I didn't flinch. No, Daniel. I let the words sink in. Slow and deliberate. I'm not Victoria. Victoria doesn't exist. Just like the man I thought I married. I placed my wedding ring on the table in front of him. The symbol of everything we had built together. Now meaningless. You taught me something, though, I continued, my voice calm but full of finality. Sometimes, what you think you want isn't what you need. He tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but I wasn't interested in his words anymore. He had made his choice long ago. And now I was making mine. I turned to leave, but paused, looking back at him one last time. By the way, the watch is real, I said, my voice almost too quiet. Unlike your promises. As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I had done what I came to do. The lies had been exposed. And now, the future was mine to claim. The days after that night felt like a strange kind of rebirth. I had expected to feel a rush of relief. Maybe even satisfaction. But instead, there was a quiet emptiness. As though a weight had been lifted that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I had stood there, watching Daniel crumble, watching the truth hit him with a force he couldn't deny. And now, with it all laid bare, I was left to pick up the pieces of my own life. I didn't cry, not yet. In the days that followed, I found myself floating through the motions, packing up his things, signing the papers, and sending him on his way. The apartment felt different without him. The space that once felt like home now felt cold and unfamiliar. Like a shell I no longer recognized. But as the days passed, I began to reclaim it. It wasn't about the apartment or the possessions, it was about me. About rediscovering who I was outside of the relationship. Outside of the life I had built with him. I threw myself into my work, immersing myself in projects that had been pushed aside for too long. The focus I once had on building a life with Daniel had dulled my sense of purpose. But now, with him gone, I realized how much I had neglected my own passions, my own goals. I remembered the woman I had been before him, the ambitious, driven person who could conquer anything she set her mind to. And I realized, in that moment, that she was still there. I started making small changes. I redecorated the apartment, reimagined the spaces that had once been shared with someone who no longer existed in my life. I bought plants, filled the shelves with books I had always meant to read but hadn't gotten around to. Each step was an act of reclaiming my space, my life, and my future. The silence that had once suffocated me now felt peaceful, almost comforting. The first time I ran into Daniel after everything happened was in a coffee shop. He looked different, thinner, worn. His eyes were downcast when he saw me. And for a moment, I felt a strange mix of sympathy and detachment. I had loved him, once, but now, I felt nothing. He approached me cautiously, trying to say something, an apology, an explanation, but I stopped him before he could go any further. I don't want to hear it, I said, my voice steady. You had your chance to be honest. You made your choice. He looked at me, the regret in his eyes clear. But there was nothing left to say. I wasn't the same person I had been when I married him. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone stronger. Someone who knew her worth. I walked away from him, not looking back. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the lies. Free from the person I had become while trying to save something that was never meant to last. And as I left that coffee shop, I realized that I was no longer tethered to my past. The future was mine again. And it was brighter than I had ever imagined. The healing didn't happen overnight. But it started there, in that quiet moment of letting go. I was building a new life. One that was just for me. No one else could define it. And as each day passed, I found myself growing stronger, more confident, and more alive than I had ever been before. The past was behind me. And the future? It was wide open.